Kethris 7 had been dying for 40 years, and Dren Calloway had been watching it happen for the last 12. Not dying dramatically, the way stations did in the entertainment feeds, with explosions and heroic last stands and beautiful people making noble sacrifices. No, Kethris 7 was dying the way everything real died. Slowly, quietly, one malfunctioning system at a time, while the people responsible for keeping it alive filed requisition forms that nobody would ever read, and pretended that next quarter's budget allocation would somehow fix everything. Dren walked through Sector 9 with his diagnostic scanner in one hand and half a sandwich in the other, chewing thoughtfully, while the scanner beeped its familiar complaints about atmospheric regulators that had been operating outside acceptable parameters since before he was born. The corridor lighting flickered twice, gave up, and plunged him into the amber glow of emergency backup systems that had themselves been emergency backup systems for something else, decades ago, before the original primaries failed, and everyone just sort of agreed to stop talking about it. "You know," he said to no one, because there was no one, because there had been no one in Sector 9 for 6 months and probably wouldn't be anyone for another 6 months. "I think processed cheese product technically counts as cheese. It has cheese in the name. That's basically a legal classification." The scanner disagreed with him, or at least beeped in a way that sounded disagreeable, and Dren took another bite of his sandwich in defiance of the universe's general indifference to his opinions about dairy categorization. He was 34 years old. He had been 34 years old for what felt like several decades. Somewhere in his quarters, buried under equipment manuals and unwashed clothing, there were certification documents that proved he had once been qualified for things that mattered, engineering work on vessels that actually went places, designs for systems that people might have used if he had ever finished them. He had started a correspondence course in advanced propulsion theory 8 years ago, completed exactly 3 modules, and then discovered that the 4th module required a practical component that would cost more than he earned in 2 years. The sandwich was actually pretty good, all things considered. The meat was probably meat. The bread was definitely bread adjacent. The cheese product was performing its cheese-related functions adequately. Sector 9 had been a cargo processing hub once, back when Kethris 7 served as a transit point for colonial supply runs and mining operations that had since moved to more profitable locations. Now it was a maze of decommissioned loading terminals, empty storage bays, and corridors that the station's environmental systems had mostly forgotten about. Dren came down here twice a week to check the atmospheric seals and make sure nothing was actively exploding, which it never was, because nothing in Sector 9 had enough energy left to explode. He rounded the corner into Bay 17, still arguing with himself about cheese, and stopped. There was someone on the floor. Dren's first thought, absurdly, was that he was going to have to fill out an incident report. And incident reports in Sector 9 required 3 separate supervisory signatures, because the area was technically classified as non-operational. And getting 3 supervisory signatures for anything took at least 2 weeks because Administrator Vex had implemented a new approval workflow that nobody understood. His second thought was that the person on the floor was not moving. His third thought was that she was the most striking woman he had ever seen, which felt inappropriate given that she might be dead. But his brain had apparently decided to process information in whatever order it wanted. She lay crumpled against a decommissioned loading terminal, her skin so pale it seemed to glow against the grime and shadows of the neglected bay. Her hair was black in a way that made other black things look like they were just pretending, spilling across the metal grating like something that had its own intentions. She wore clothing that Dren couldn't identify, simple and formless, the kind of thing that suggested either poverty or the sort of wealth that didn't need to prove anything. And her ears. Long, elegant, tapering to points that marked her as definitively, unmistakably not human. Dren had seen non-humans before, of course. Kethris 7 sat at the edge of inhabited space, close enough to the border territories that refugees and traders and occasionally less legitimate travelers passed through when the main transit routes became too watched. But he had never seen anyone who looked quite like this. Human in almost every detail except for those ears, and something in the proportions of her face that suggested a sculptor had started with humanity, and then decided to make improvements. "Hey," he said, and his voice came out strange in the empty bay, too loud and too soft at the same time. "Hey, are you okay?" She flinched. The movement was small, barely visible, but it told him she was alive and conscious and terrified. Dren set down his scanner and his sandwich approached slowly, the way he might approach a damaged system that could short-circuit at any moment. "I'm not going to hurt you. I work here." "Well, I work in other parts of here, but technically this is all the same here. Maintenance. I fix things that are broken, and I pretend to fix things that are too broken to actually fix. I'm rambling because you look scared and I don't know what else to do. Are you hurt?" She watched him with eyes that seemed to contain depths he couldn't measure, dark and ancient, and filled with something that might have been hope, or might have been the final exhaustion of hope. And Dren felt suddenly aware that he was standing in a forgotten cargo bay in a stained work uniform, holding a diagnostic scanner that had been obsolete when his parents were young, talking to someone who clearly came from somewhere far beyond anything he would ever understand. "I'm Dren," he said. "Do you have a name? Do you have anywhere to go? Do you need help?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and then her gaze dropped to the sandwich he had set aside, wrapped in its thermal foil, still warm. Dren followed her eyes and felt something shift in his chest, some small rearrangement of the way he understood the universe. She was hungry. Whatever else she was, wherever else she came from, she was hungry, and that was something he knew how to fix. "Here," he said, picking up the sandwich and unwrapping it with fingers that were surprisingly steady. "It's not great. The meat is probably meat. I'm about 70% sure. The cheese is legally required to be called cheese product, which I personally think is unfair because it tastes like cheese and it melts like cheese. So what else does cheese need to do? But it's food and it's warm, and I already ate half of it, so you might as well have the rest." He held it out to her, and she stared at it as though he had offered her something impossible, something that violated laws she had believed were unbreakable. Then slowly, she took it from his hand. She ate carefully, precisely, as though she had been taught that even eating should be done with intention and grace, and Dren sat down on the cold floor across from her and waited, because waiting seemed like the right thing to do. "You're not going to call station security," she said finally, and her voice was like her eyes, layered with things he couldn't identify. Dren considered the question. Station security was two people, both of whom were usually drunk, and calling them would require explaining why he had been in Sector 9 alone, which would require explaining that he preferred solitary inspections because his coworkers talked too much about sports he didn't follow. It would also require paperwork. "Do you want me to call station security?" he asked. "No." "Then I won't." He shrugged. "I found you in an abandoned cargo bay eating half my lunch. That's not really a security emergency. That's just a Tuesday, or whatever day it is. I've honestly lost track." Something changed in her expression, so slight that he might have imagined it, but it looked almost like the beginning of a smile. "Do you have anywhere to go?" He asked again. "No." Dren nodded slowly, looking at this impossible woman with her ancient eyes and her elegant ears and her obvious terror, and he made a decision that he knew was stupid even as he made it. The kind of decision that would generate paperwork and complications, and probably end with him explaining himself to Administrator Vex in her office with the inspirational posters about regulatory compliance. "Okay," he said. "Then you can stay with me for a while. My quarters are small, but they're warm, and I have more sandwiches. Better sandwiches, actually. I have one with actual vegetables in it, or things that used to be vegetables." "Close enough." She stared at him as though he had spoken in a language she didn't recognize, and Dren realized that he had no idea what he was doing, No idea who she was. No idea what forces had deposited her in his forgotten corner of the universe. But she was scared, and she was hungry, and she was alone. He knew how to fix those things, at least for a little while. "Come on," he said, standing and offering his hand. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Dren's quarters had been designed for one person who didn't own many things and didn't have particularly strong opinions about personal space. Adding a second person transformed the small room into an exercise in constant negotiation, a delicate choreography of movements and compromises that neither of them had signed up for, but both of them were apparently committed to figuring out. "The bathroom schedule," Dren said on the second morning, standing in the narrow corridor between his bed and the food preparation unit, "is going to be the thing that breaks us. I can feel it. Great civilizations have fallen over less." Vela, she had told him her name on the first night, offering it like a gift she wasn't sure he deserved, sat on the edge of his bed with her knees drawn up to her chest, watching him with those impossible eyes. She had slept for 14 hours straight after he brought her to his quarters, a deep and motionless sleep that had made him check twice to make sure she was still breathing. Now she looked slightly less like someone who had been running from death itself, though the wariness hadn't left her expression. "I don't understand," she said. "The bathroom, we have one. There are two of us. Mathematics suggests this will become problematic." Dren opened a storage compartment and began rummaging through his collection of meal packs, most of which had exceeded their suggested consumption dates by margins he preferred not to calculate. "I usually shower at 0600 station time, but that's also when the water pressure is best, so if you want the good water pressure, we're going to have to work something out. I'm willing to negotiate. I have almost no leverage, since you're the guest, but I want you to know that I'm willing to pretend I have leverage." Vela tilted her head slightly, and her long ears caught the dim light in a way that made them seem almost translucent. "You're giving me your bed. The floor isn't that bad. I found a thermal blanket in the emergency supplies. It's only slightly older than the station itself. And you're sharing your food. I have more food than I need. Maintenance workers get decent rations because they figured out years ago that hungry maintenance workers make mistakes. And mistakes on a station, this old, tend to involve things exploding or people breathing vacuum. It's purely self-interested, really. The corporation doesn't want to pay for replacement workers." She was quiet for a moment, processing something that seemed to require more thought than his words warranted. "Why are you doing this?" Dren stopped rummaging and turned to face her, holding a meal pack that promised to contain something called Heritage Protein Medley, which he was fairly certain was a lie on at least two of those three words. "Honestly, I don't know. You looked scared and you were hungry and I had a sandwich. That's not really a philosophy or anything. It's just what happened. People don't help strangers, not where I come from." "People don't help strangers where I come from either," Dren admitted. "But you're not really a stranger anymore. We've shared a bathroom schedule negotiation. That's basically a binding social contract." The corner of her mouth twitched, and Dren felt an absurd surge of triumph at having provoked something that might eventually become a smile. The days developed their own rhythm after that. Dren still had to work. His absence would trigger questions he couldn't answer, so he left each morning with instructions for Vela to stay quiet, stay hidden, and please not touch the environmental controls, because he had them calibrated in a very specific way that he couldn't actually explain, but definitely didn't want disrupted. She followed his instructions with a precision that suggested she was accustomed to following rules, or possibly accustomed to giving them. And each evening when he returned, she was exactly where he had left her, sitting on his bed, watching the door. "You can move around," he told her on the fourth day. "I'm not keeping you prisoner. That would be weird and creepy and also technically illegal under station regulations, though I'm not actually sure which regulations because I've never read most of them. I don't want to disturb your things." Dren looked around his quarters at the unwashed clothing, the scattered equipment manuals, the collection of broken devices he kept meaning to repair, and the stack of meal-pack containers he kept meaning to dispose of. My things are already disturbed. They were disturbed when they got here. You'd have to work really hard to make them worse. She started moving around after that, exploring his small space with a curiosity that seemed almost archaeological, as though she were studying artifacts from a civilization she had only read about. She picked up his engineering certifications and examined them with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She found his half-finished correspondence course materials and asked questions about propulsion theory that he couldn't answer because he had never gotten to the parts that would have taught him. She discovered his collection of entertainment recordings, mostly old dramas about people with exciting lives on exciting stations where things actually happened, and watched 3 of them in succession with an expression of bewildered fascination. "These people," she said, gesturing at the screen where a handsome engineer was dramatically repairing a hull breach while delivering a speech about the importance of human connection. "They don't do any paperwork. They never file requisition forms. They just fix things and have feelings." "It's fiction," Dren explained. "Real maintenance work is 90% paperwork and 10% trying to find replacement parts that don't exist anymore." "That seems inefficient." "It's incredibly inefficient, but the paperwork gives management something to read, and it gives us something to blame when things go wrong. The whole system runs on blame. It's actually quite elegant in a terrible way." On the 6th night, he taught her to play Void's Fortune. The game was simple enough. Match cards, build sequences, bluff your opponents into folding. But Vela approached it with a concentration that suggested she was preparing for combat rather than entertainment. Dren explained the rules twice, demonstrated a few hands, and then watched in growing disbelief as she proceeded to win 7 games in a row. "You're cheating," he said. "I don't know how, but you're definitely cheating." "I'm not cheating. I'm observing patterns and calculating probabilities." She laid down another winning sequence with an expression that might have been innocent if her eyes hadn't held the unmistakable gleam of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "You touch the left side of your cards when you're bluffing. You breathe differently when you have a strong hand. Your left eyebrow moves approximately 2 millimeters when you're considering a risky play. That's cheating. That's just cheating with extra steps. It's paying attention." Dren stared at her, at this strange woman who had appeared in his life like an anomaly in the station's sensor logs, and he laughed. He couldn't help it. The absurdity of the situation of everything suddenly seemed hilarious. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you win. You win at cards, you win at paying attention, you win at whatever this is. I surrender. What do you want as your prize?" Something shifted in her expression, something vulnerable and unexpected. "Tell me about the star charts." "The what?" "The paintings on the walls of the observation dome. The ones that everyone walks past without seeing. Tell me about them." Dren had worked on Kethris 7 for 12 years, and had never given the observation dome murals more than a passing glance. They were old, faded, covered in layers of grime and neglect, and everyone assumed they were decorative remnants from the station's original construction. But Vela led him to the dome that night, after the corridors had emptied and the station had settled into its sleeping rhythm, and she stood before the painted walls with something like reverence in her ancient eyes. "These are navigation charts," she said softly, "mathematical representations of transit routes between stars. The notation system is older than human spaceflight, older than your species' first cities." She traced a symbol with her finger, not quite touching the paint. "This one represents the relationship between stellar mass and fold space stability. This one describes the harmonic frequencies required for safe passage through gravitational boundaries." Dren looked at the symbols he had ignored for over a decade and felt the universe expand around him, vast and old and filled with knowledge he had never suspected. "Who painted these?" he asked. Vela was quiet for a long moment. "My people. A very long time ago, when this region of space was part of something larger. She began to teach him to read them, and Dren listened, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice suggested that the woman standing beside him knew far more about the universe than any refugee should. He ignored the voice. It was probably just his imagination. The observation dome had become their place. Not officially, not by any agreement they had spoken aloud, but by the quiet accumulation of evenings spent watching the void together until watching the void together became something they both needed. Dren sat with his back against the curved wall, his legs stretched out on the cold floor, while Vela stood at the transparency, her pale skin reflecting the distant light of stars that had been burning since before either of their species had learned to count. The dome was empty at this hour, as it was most hours, because the crew of Kethris 7 had long since stopped finding wonder in the universe and had redirected their attention to more immediate concerns like shift schedules and ration allocations, and who had stolen the good coffee from the break room. "I had a family once," Dren said. The words came out before he had decided to say them, which was how the important words usually worked. "Parents, 2 brothers, a sister. We lived on a mining colony called Verath 3. Mineral extraction, mostly. The kind of work that sounds impressive until you realize it's just people digging holes in rocks and hoping the rocks have something valuable inside." Vela turned from the window, her long ears silhouetted against the starfield, and Dren felt the weight of her attention settle on him like something physical. "The colony failed," he continued. "Not dramatically. No explosions, no disasters, nothing that would make a good story. The company just decided the extraction yields weren't profitable enough anymore, so they pulled out, offered relocation packages to anyone who wanted them. My parents went to one place, my brothers went to another, my sister went somewhere else entirely. I came here." He gestured vaguely at the walls around them. "We meant to stay in contact. That was the plan. Everyone always has a plan. But you didn't. Communication costs credits. Credits require work. Work requires time. Time keeps passing." Dren shrugged, a small movement that contained 12 years of accumulated distance. "I have a brother on a station somewhere in the Kepler sector, I think, unless he moved. I have a sister who got married to someone whose name I've forgotten. My parents are probably still alive. Probably. You don't know." I stopped checking. It seemed easier than checking and finding out things I didn't want to know. He laughed, but the sound came out wrong, too hollow for humor. "That's pathetic, isn't it? I'm 34 years old, I've been on the station for over a decade, and I've let every meaningful connection in my life fade away because maintaining them required effort I didn't want to make." Vela crossed the dome and sat down beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence but not so close that they touched. "You said you had a fiancé once." Dren had mentioned Sira exactly once, in passing, during a conversation about why his quarters contained no personal photographs. He hadn't expected Vela to remember. "I did. Her name was Sira. She was smart and ambitious and beautiful and completely certain that she was going to be somewhere better than Kethris 7 within 5 years." He paused. "She was right. She got a posting on a research station in the inner systems. Better pay, better facilities, better everything. She asked me to come with her. You said no. I said I needed more time to think about it. I said I had responsibilities here. I said a lot of things that sounded reasonable but were really just fear dressed up in sensible clothing." Dren stared at the floor between his feet. "She left. I stayed. End of story." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was full, heavy with things that wanted to be said. "I understand responsibility," Vela said finally. "I understand what it means to have a role assigned to you by circumstances you never chose, to be expected to fulfill functions that have nothing to do with who you actually are." Dren looked at her, at the strange and beautiful woman who had appeared in his life like a disruption in the station's routine diagnostics. "What kind of role?" She was quiet for a long moment, and he watched the play of distant starlight across her features. "I was born into a position of significance," she said. "Not because of anything I did or any qualities I possessed, but simply because of who my parents were and what that meant in the structure of my society. From the moment I was old enough to understand language, I was trained for functions I never asked to perform. I was taught to speak in ways that inspired confidence. I was taught to make decisions that affected lives I would never see. I was taught that my preferences were irrelevant, that my desires were secondary to my duties." Dren processed this slowly, trying to map her words onto something he could understand. "So you were like, what, some kind of leader? A politician, a religious figure?" The corner of her mouth curved slightly, "Something like that. And you ran away." "I was removed from my situation against my will, and then I chose not to return." She looked at him directly, her ancient eyes holding his. "There is a difference, though I am not certain it matters." Dren wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what kind of society produced someone like Vela, what kind of hierarchy she had fled, what kind of forces might still be searching for her. But the questions felt intrusive, like reaching into wounds that hadn't finished healing. Instead, he said, "I have a confession to make." Vela's expression shifted to wariness. "Yes. I've been thinking about that card game, and I've realized that you were right. I do touch the left side of my cards when I'm bluffing. I spent 3 hours yesterday trying to train myself to stop, and now I touch the right side instead, which is probably worse because it's obvious that I'm trying not to touch the left side." He shook his head mournfully. "I have betrayed myself. I have become predictable in my unpredictability." The wariness dissolved into something softer. "You're absurd. I've been told, frequently, by people with much more authority than you." He grinned at her. "Administrator Vex once called me aggressively unserious in a performance review. I had it framed. Well, I would have had it framed, but framing costs credits and also requires effort." Vela laughed. It was a small sound, almost startled, as though she had forgotten that laughing was something she could do. Dren felt the sound settle into him, warm and unexpected, and he realized that making her laugh had become important to him in ways he wasn't ready to examine. "Look," she said suddenly, pointing toward the transparency. Dren followed her gesture and saw it, a star, brighter than the others around it, beginning to change. The light was shifting, pulsing, expanding in ways that seemed to violate the steady constancy he had always associated with distant suns. "What is that?" "A supernova," Vela said. "The beginning of one. The light we are seeing left that star thousands of years ago. By now it has already died. We are watching a ghost." They sat together in silence, watching the ancient light of a dead star paint colors across the dome that Dren had never seen before. "The civilization around that star," Vela said, her voice barely above a whisper, "was called the Vethari. They were the first to join my people's alliance, 12,000 years ago. They built ships that could sing, vessels that navigated by harmony rather than mathematics. Their art was considered sacred across 40 systems." Dren turned to look at her and saw tears on her cheeks, silent and steady, catching the supernova's light like tiny mirrors. "Now their descendants will watch their ancestors' sun die," she continued. "They will know what was lost. They will remember." He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to comfort someone grieving for a civilization he had never heard of, a history that spanned millennia he couldn't comprehend. So he did the only thing that felt right. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the remaining half of his dinner ration and held it out to her. "Here," he said. "It's not much, it's not anything really, but it's warm." Vela took the food from his hand, and for a moment their fingers touched. "Thank you," she said, and the words seemed to mean more than the food, more than the gesture, more than anything Dren knew how to name. They sat together until the supernova faded into the background of ordinary starlight, and Dren thought about ghosts, about light that traveled for thousands of years to reach eyes that could witness its dying, about the strange woman beside him who carried histories he would never fully understand. He almost kissed her. The thought arrived without permission, sudden and certain, and he turned toward her in the amber emergency lighting. His work terminal beeped. The message on his terminal was marked Priority Alpha, which was a classification Dren had never seen used for anything real. Priority Alpha was theoretical, a category that existed in the emergency protocols, but had never been invoked in the 12 years he had worked on Kethris 7. The station received priority standard messages about supply shipments and priority elevated messages about regulatory compliance deadlines, and occasionally priority urgent messages about equipment failures that might kill everyone if not addressed within 72 hours. Priority Alpha was supposed to be reserved for situations that threatened the fundamental existence of the station itself. Dren read the message 3 times before the words started to make sense. All personnel report to Central Operations. External contact established. Repeat, external contact established. This is not a drill. External contact, he muttered, still staring at the screen. External contact with what? Vela had gone very still beside him. When he turned to look at her, the color had drained from her already pale face, leaving her looking like something carved from ice and shadow. I need to go back to your quarters, she said. What? No, we should find out what's happening. External contact could mean anything. Could be a trade delegation, could be first contact with a new species, could be. Dren. Her voice was sharp in a way he had never heard before, cutting through his speculation like a blade through thermal foil. I need to go back to your quarters, now. He looked at her, at the fear that had replaced everything soft in her expression, and something cold began to form in his chest. Vela, what's going on? She didn't answer. She was already moving toward the dome's exit, her steps quick and precise, and Dren had to jog to keep up with her. They made it back to his quarters without encountering anyone, the corridors eerily empty as the rest of the crew responded to the Priority Alpha summons. Vela sealed the door behind them and stood in the center of his small room, her hands clasped together, her ancient eyes fixed on nothing. Tell me, Dren said. I cannot. Tell me anyway. She turned to face him, and for a moment she looked like a different person entirely, someone harder and more distant than the woman who had laughed at his card-playing failures and wept for a dying star. There are things about me that I have not told you, she said. I figured that out. The crying over 12,000-year-old civilizations was a hint. He tried to make the words light, tried to find the humor that had carried them through the past 11 days, but it wouldn't come. Who are you, Vela? Before she could answer, his terminal beeped again. Another message, this one marked with symbols he didn't recognize, overlaid on the station's standard communication format like something that had forced its way into systems that weren't designed to receive it. The message was short. It was written in standard, the common language of human-inhabited space, but the phrasing was strange, formal in ways that suggested translation from something older. To the administrators of this facility, we seek the Empress Vela Sorrenthes of the Ascendancy of 9 Spirals. She departed her coronation vessel 11 days ago following an assassination attempt. Our records indicate her escape pod entered this sector. You will confirm her presence and ensure her safety. Failure to respond will be interpreted as hostility. A delegation will arrive to retrieve her within 6 hours. Dren read the message. Read it again. Looked at Vela, who was watching him with an expression that mixed fear and resignation and something that might have been apology. Empress, he said. Yes. Of the Ascendancy of 9 Spirals. Yes. Which is, if I'm remembering my very limited knowledge of galactic politics correctly, an interstellar empire spanning approximately 40,000 worlds. 43,000 as of the last census. She paused. But several border systems are disputed. Dren sat down on the edge of his bed, not because he chose to, but because his legs had apparently decided to stop supporting him. You're the Empress of 43,000 worlds. But I had not yet been formally crowned. The assassination attempt occurred during the coronation ceremony itself. Technically, I am the Empress designate, though the distinction is largely ceremonial at this point. But, oh well, if it's largely ceremonial. Dren heard his own voice as though from a great distance, thin and strange. That changes everything. Here I was worried that I'd been harboring the absolute ruler of a significant portion of the galaxy in my maintenance worker quarters, but if it's largely ceremonial. Dren, I taught you to play cards. He looked up at her and the absurdity of everything crashed over him like a wave. I taught an empress to play Void's fortune. I accused you of cheating. I said your card counting was cheating with extra steps. It was cheating with extra steps. You ate my sandwiches. You ate my processed cheese product sandwiches, and you thanked me like I had given you something precious. Vela crossed the room and knelt in front of him, bringing her eyes level with his. This close, he could see the fine details of her face, the delicate points of her ears, the depths in her gaze that he had always sensed but never fully understood. You did give me something precious, she said. You gave me 11 days of being a person instead of a symbol. You gave me food without asking what I could offer in return. You gave me silence that expected nothing. You taught me a foolish card game and told me jokes about cheese classifications and treated me as though I were simply someone who needed help. Her voice cracked slightly. Do you understand how long it has been since anyone treated me that way? Dren stared at her. The most powerful person in 43,000 worlds kneeling on the floor of his cramped quarters, and he felt his anger dissolve into something more complicated. You could have told me. Would you have believed me? He considered the question honestly. No, probably not. I would have assumed you were delusional or lying or both. And you would have treated me differently. You would have been careful around me, formal, worried about giving offense. You would have stopped making jokes about bathroom schedules and terrible food and your own inadequacies at card games. She smiled, but the smile was sad. I did not want that. I wanted what you were giving me, which was the experience of being ordinary. You're the least ordinary person I've ever met. I know that's the problem. Outside his quarters, Dren could hear sounds of activity, voices raised in confusion and excitement. The station was waking up to the reality that something unprecedented was happening, that the larger universe had noticed their forgotten corner of space. What happens now? He asked. Vela stood, and the motion carried a grace he had noticed before but now understood differently, the grace of someone trained from birth to move like a symbol of power. My fleet will arrive in 6 hours. They will want to see me to confirm that I am safe, to restore me to my position. She looked toward the door as though she could see through it to the ships that were already coming. There will be ceremonies, investigations. The people who attempted to kill me will need to be found and dealt with. The coronation will need to be completed. 43,000 worlds will be waiting for their empress to assume her throne. And you'll go back to all of that. But I must. Dren nodded slowly. He had known on some level that she would leave. Everyone left Kethris 7 eventually, one way or another. It was that kind of place. You know, he said, when I found you in that cargo bay, I thought the biggest complication in my life was going to be explaining the unauthorized guest on my requisition reports. I had this whole plan for falsifying sanitation records to cover the extra water usage. He managed a small smile. I really underestimated the situation. Vela laughed, and the sound was both familiar and impossibly distant, a reminder of the 11 days they had shared and the gulf that had always existed between them. Will you do something for me? She asked. Probably. I seem to have developed a habit of doing things for you. Walk with me to the central platform when the fleet arrives. I do not want to face them alone. Dren looked at her. This empress of 43,000 worlds who had eaten his sandwiches and beaten him at cards and wept for civilizations he had never known. And he understood that this was goodbye dressed up as a request. Yeah, he said. Okay, I can do that. The fleet emerged from fold space like a wound opening in the fabric of reality. One moment the void outside Kethris 7 held nothing but the familiar scatter of distant stars, and the next moment there were ships, hundreds of them, thousands of them, vessels of such size and design that Dren's mind struggled to process what his eyes were reporting. They filled the observation windows like a metallic storm, their hulls catching the light of the local sun and reflecting it back in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost beautiful, almost terrifying. Dren stood on the central platform beside Vela and tried to remember how to breathe. "That's a lot of ships," he said. "The 7th Expeditionary Fleet," Vela replied. Her voice had changed over the past 6 hours, hardening into something more formal, more distant. She was already becoming the Empress again, layer by layer, and Dren could feel her slipping away even though she stood close enough to touch. 1,200 vessels. They were the nearest force capable of responding to my location signal. The nearest force. Right. Dren watched another wave of ships emerge from fold space, each one larger than anything he had ever seen. So this is what a small welcoming party, a casual retrieval. By the standards of the Ascendancy, yes. Around them, the crew of Kethris 7 had gathered in various states of shock and confusion. Administrator Vex stood near the main console, her face cycling through expressions that suggested her brain was attempting to process approximately 17 impossible things simultaneously. The 2 security officers, notably sober for the first time in Dren's memory, kept their hands near their weapons as though sidearms designed to stop unruly drunks might somehow be relevant against an Imperial armada. "Administrator Vex," Vela said, and her voice carried across the platform with an authority that silenced every other sound. "I wish to thank you and your crew for the hospitality extended to me during my unexpected stay. The Ascendancy of 9 Spirals will remember Kethris 7 with gratitude." Vex opened her mouth, closed it, and then managed, "You're welcome. Your maintenance engineer, Dren Calloway, provided me with shelter and sustenance during a time of great vulnerability. His kindness will not be forgotten." Every eye on the platform turned to Dren, and he felt his face grow warm under the sudden attention. "It was mostly sandwiches," he said, "and one of them had questionable cheese product. I feel like that should be disclosed." Vela's expression flickered, just for a moment, and Dren saw the woman he had known for 11 days surface briefly beneath the Empress she was becoming. Then the moment passed, and she was formal again, distant again, a symbol preparing to resume her function. A docking request came through the station's communication system, and Vex fumbled with the controls to authorize it. The flagship, a vessel so large that it made the station itself look like a component part, extended a connection bridge toward Kethris 7 primary airlock. The process took 17 minutes, during which nobody on the platform spoke and Dren contemplated the bizarre trajectory of his life. When the airlock finally cycled open, the people who emerged were exactly what Dren had expected, and also nothing like he had imagined. They wore uniforms of deep blue and silver, cut in styles that suggested military precision softened by aesthetic consideration. Their ears were long and elegant like Vela's, marking them as her people, and they moved with the coordinated grace of individuals who had spent their lives serving something larger than themselves. The leader of the delegation was a tall woman with silver hair and eyes that had clearly seen things Dren would never understand. She crossed the platform to Vela and executed a bow so precisely calibrated that it seemed to contain entire volumes of protocol and meaning. "Empress Designate," she said, "I am Fleet Admiral Tessara Morvin. The Ascendancy rejoices at your survival." "Admiral Morvin." Vela's voice was steady, imperial, nothing like the voice that had laughed about bathroom schedules and card games. "Your response was swift. I commend your efficiency. We have been searching since the moment your escape pod launched. The assassination attempt has been contained. 14 conspirators have been identified and detained. The coronation ceremony can resume at your convenience." Dren listened to this exchange and felt the distance between his world and Vela's expanding with every word. This was what she was returning to. Fleets and admirals and conspirators and ceremonies. A universe of power and responsibility that had nothing to do with maintenance work and processed food and forgotten stations at the edge of inhabited space. Vela turned to look at him, and for a moment the Empress disappeared and she was simply the woman he had found in a cargo bay, scared and hungry and alone. "Dren Calloway," she said, and her voice carried across the platform for everyone to hear. "You offered me kindness when you had no reason to do so. You shared your food when you did not know who I was. You gave me shelter without asking what I could offer in return." She paused, and something in her expression shifted. "The ascendancy honors those who serve its sovereign. You will be remembered." "I didn't serve anyone," Dren said. "I just gave you a sandwich. Sometimes that is enough." She stepped toward him, closing the distance that protocol and propriety demanded she maintain, and Dren saw the Admiral's expression flicker with surprise. This was not how empresses behaved. This was not how symbols conducted themselves. Vela reached out and took his hand, and the touch was warm and real and impossibly brief. "I will not forget," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. 11 days, Void's fortune, the supernova, the observation dome. I will carry all of it. Even the cheese product." She smiled, and the smile was genuine, unguarded, a gift she was giving him in front of everyone who would never understand its meaning. Especially the cheese product. Then she released his hand and turned toward the docking bridge, toward the flagship and the fleet and the 43,000 worlds waiting for their empress. The delegation fell into formation around her, and Dren watched her walk away, her borrowed coveralls still bearing his name on the chest pocket. She stopped at the threshold of the airlock, turned back, looked at him one final time. In her hand, Dren saw something small and silver folded into a precise square. The thermal foil wrapper from his sandwich, the first thing he had ever given her, preserved like something precious. Then she stepped through the airlock, and the door sealed behind her, and she was gone. The fleet departed 3 hours later, ships folding back into the void one by one until the space around Kethris 7 was empty again, ordinary again, as though nothing had happened. Dren returned to his quarters and found them exactly as he had left them, small, cluttered, unremarkable. The bed where Vela had slept was just a bed. The floor where he had spread his thermal blanket was just a floor. The room held no trace of emperors or empires, no evidence that for 11 days it had sheltered the most powerful person in the known galaxy, except for the note on his pillow. It was written in a language he didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. But as he held the paper, the meaning settled into his mind like something that had always been there, waiting to be understood. "You gave me sandwiches and silence and 11 days of being simply a person. I cannot give you 43,000 worlds in return, but I can give you this, a promise that you are not forgotten, and a coordinate sequence that will mean something important when the universe decides you have waited long enough. Watch the sky, Dren Calloway. I will find a way to thank you properly." Below the words, a string of numbers that meant nothing to him, coordinates perhaps, or a mathematical sequence or something else entirely. Dren sat on his bed and held the note and thought about everything that had changed and everything that would remain the same. Tomorrow, he would return to his maintenance rounds. He would file requisition forms and argue with Administrator Vex about budget allocations and eat sandwiches alone in forgotten cargo bays. His life would continue in its familiar patterns, small and quiet and unremarkable. But he would watch the sky now. He would look at the stars and remember that one of them, somewhere among the billions, belonged to a woman who had eaten his lunch